Welcome to the Exam Room Podcast, brought to you by the Physicians Committee. Hello, I'm the weight loss champion, Chuck Carroll. Thank you so very much for watching and downloading in more than 150 countries around the world and making the Exam Room one of the most consumed nutrition podcasts anywhere on the planet today. And on this day, the topic is stress. You know, it can really wreck a person's life, but did you know in certain cases it can actually be really good for you too? Well, to talk all about that is a first-time guest on the show. She is Dr. Sharon Bergquist. She's an award-winning physician, an innovative healthcare leader, a visionary researcher renowned for spearheading a science-based approach to applying lifestyle as medicine. Love to hear that. And you may have seen her, you may have heard her on Good Morning America, CNN, NPR, read about her in the Wall Street Journal, or maybe you listened to her own podcast called the Whole Health Cure Podcast. Well, she's also the author of a brand new book called The Stress Paradox: Why You Need Stress to Live Longer, Healthier, and Happier. We're going to get into it all today with Dr. Sharon. Thank you so very much for being here. Great to make your acquaintance.
Oh, Chuck, it's an honor being here. Thank you so much.
Let's talk about stress, shall we?
Absolutely.
All right. My first question is this: stress, before we get into the book and why we actually need it to be healthier, I'm just curious, with all of the health trends that we're facing, the skyrocketing rates of chronic diseases, obesity, a lot of the blame gets put on food and sedentary lifestyle. But how big of a role do you think stress plays in those skyrocketing rates?
Well, it plays a role really in two ways. So we know that chronic stress is a big contributor to inflammation, which is one of the underlying causes behind these chronic diseases, premature aging. But the other part, and this is the part that we'll get into and I'm excited to share with the listeners, is that lack of good stress is also contributing to these skyrocketing rates of both mental and physical illnesses.
Okay, here we go. Then let's talk about that good stress versus that bad stress. Give us an example of what you would call good stress.
So good stressors are brief, they're controlled, and they activate parts of our cells that have protective functions. So examples are high intensity interval training, plant phytochemicals, which I'm really excited to talk about with this audience, and eating in a circadian pattern, a form of intermittent fasting, heat, cold. These are also common practices, some good mental and emotional challenges. These can all be good stress.
All right. Back this up. Help me understand here. So you're saying that eating these plant phytochemicals can actually stress out the body, but it's a positive kind of stress. So a two-part question then. Number one, how does a plant phytochemical stress out the body? And then two, how does it use that good stress then to catapult us to a healthier future?
Yeah, so really it goes back to what happens when we good stress our body. And the stress response that we're all familiar with is this fight or flight. And it's this alarm system that releases cortisol, epinephrine, norepinephrine. But there's another layer of stress response that happens in our body when we're exposed to stress, and it's happening at the level of our cells. And there are 7 cellular stress responses, and they control functions such as ramping up our antioxidant defenses, managing our inflammation, which I think we're very familiar with, but they also ramp up autophagy, which is a cleanup process in our cells. They ramp up heat shock proteins and this unfolded protein response that help repair our proteins. They also have a DNA damage response that helps us repair DNA. So what happens when we expose ourselves and really through these lifestyle mechanisms is that we're activating this cellular stress response, and it's happening on a slower time scale. So it's hours, days, even a lifetime after the stress exposure, where we're building stress resistance by ramping up these cell protective mechanisms. So what happens then when we're talking about plant-based foods is that the phytochemicals in plants are actually toxins. So the reason plants make phytochemicals is to increase their stress resistance. when they're exposed to sunlight, drought, heat, predators, even us as humans, they make the phytochemicals as natural pesticides, and that enhances the plant survival. When we as humans consume these plant phytochemicals, it ramps up our stress defenses. And we had to do this evolutionarily because our survival really depended on the variety of edible plants we could consume, right? We did not want to starve. So our ancestors adapted ways to consume the biggest variety of calories from different plant food. And we ramped up our stress resistance so that we can consume more food. That's how we survived. And that is still a part of this gift, the DNA that we've inherited from our ancestors, that when we consume these plant toxins, it ramps up our stress defenses. And these stress defenses are the very defense mechanisms we need to counter all the processes that are leading to these chronic diseases you mentioned, the accelerated aging.
Well, that's interesting. So you do get that stress effect then from eating a plant, which is their own, as you said, natural pesticide. But I've heard people say that also if you eat like a steak or a piece of chicken, you're actually consuming some stress hormone from that animal because of the way that they were killed. And then that hormone gets trapped in that tissue. You ingest it. Therefore, you then take on that stress. I'm not sure how much validity there is to that. Are you familiar with that as well?
I'm not, but those would be stress hormones. And what we're talking about here are the phytochemicals that we, over millions of years, have adapted to recognize as a good stress. And that's what ramps up our stress responses. So we're not just passively getting stress hormones. The key here is that this is the key that's unlocking our natural defenses.
So, how would these natural defenses then that we build up? It sounds almost like you're ramping it up, almost like it's an immune system, and you're trying to become a little bit more immune to the stress. So, by eating this way, by leading a more healthy type of lifestyle, then that could offset the bad stresses in your life. You know, the frustrations that we get at work every day, a fight with the spouse, those types of things that always seem to just make us want to pull our hair out, and we just can't take anymore.
And that's exactly right. So historically, we have identified stress as a chronic stress, right? That's the kind that we just assume when we hear the word stress. And we know certainly it harms. There's no question about that. But more recent science is showing that stress can be very beneficial. It can strengthen us, it can enhance us. And the paradox really is that we need these good stressors to build resilience against the chronic stressors that are draining us and making us sick. So our goal isn't to get rid of stress in our lives and to cure it. Our goal is really to optimize stress.
Optimize stress. I like that. So, what are some of the big stress relieving foods out there? Are all plant foods universally as effective, or are there some that you think the exam roomies should be keying in on?
Well, we know for sure that there are at least 10 phytochemicals that have this capacity to ramp up our stress defenses, but these are just the best studied ones. There are ones like resveratrol, sulforaphane, genistein, luteolin, and we can get into more on which foods have these. But really, there's probably every phytochemical has this ability because we have evolved with our plant environment for most of our human history. And this relationship of our interconnectedness and interdependence really happens with an abundant different types of phytochemicals.
Yeah, but let's still go ahead and name some specific foods because I'm sure that, the audience, they just want to make a shopping list here. So, what are the ones that contain the abundant amount of those that you were just talking about?
So if we just, for example, looked at sulforaphane, which is in cruciferous vegetables, in cabbage and broccoli and kale, that is a very effective phytochemical for ramping up our antioxidant defenses through this transcription factor called NRF2 for people who are science inclined and interested in the mechanism of how it does this. Another that is very potent, that gets a lot of attention, is resveratrol. And the really cool thing about resveratrol is that it activates the sirtuin pathway. And that pathway has gotten a lot of attention as a longevity pathway. And the sirtuins help build up our mitochondria. They help create mitochondrial biogenesis, which is creating new mitochondria. And that is such a key part of improving our metabolic health, which underlies so many aspects of our health. And you can get resveratrol from grapes, pistachios, berries, dark chocolate, which is my favorite. Another one is this plant chemical called allicin. It's in garlic, onions, leek, shallots. And the really cool thing about allicin is that it allows these pores that let calcium come in, and that activates growth factors. And it also stimulates our antioxidant response, DNA damage response, inflammatory response. Quercetin is another one. It's in apples, onions, capers. All of the stress responses that we're talking about are activated by quercetin. Capsaicin in chili peppers, cayenne peppers. It stimulates an inflammatory response and growth factors. Curcumin is another, EGCG, genistein. So they're really an abundant amount.
That sounds like that typical prescription for just eat a wide array of fruits and vegetables and whole grains, and you're going to be in pretty good shape, making sure that your body gets what it needs. You're very funny. You made me laugh off camera just now when you preface something that you said with, for those who are science inclined. Dr. Sharon, we have a term on the show that I like to use called nerd out. I mean, we love to nerd out here. So, I mean, you just nerded us out in a beautiful way. So I think that we're all kind of science inclined. So go ahead and nerd out as you will for the remainder of the interview. Fascinating stuff. I'm also really happy that kale made the list. I'm pretty sure that that's just one of those foods that just, I mean, for the win in almost every category, kale is pretty cool. But let's go ahead and flip the script then. Let's talk about some of the foods that may really stress out the body in an unhealthy way. There's a lot of talk right now, a lot of debate about these ultra processed foods. Have you seen any research, or are you familiar with any that really talk about undoing a lot of the healthy stress production that you're talking about thus far? Is an ultra processed diet something that's going to stress the body out in a bad way?
Yeah, and this is really just a beautiful way of looking at health, right? Because we know that ultra processed foods, I think of them as bad stress, that they can harm us. And one study that I think can help us look at both these good stressors and bad stressors is this global burden of disease study. It was done in 195 countries over 27 years. Probably a lot of listeners may be familiar with it. But it found that the leading cause of mortality, 1 in 5 deaths, is attributed to food. But the fascinating part about this study is that the deaths that were attributed to the processed foods, the processed meats, the sugars, essentially, the number of deaths from that were so much fewer in number than the number of deaths from what we weren't getting enough of. Not enough fruits and vegetables, not enough, essentially all the plant food categories, not enough nuts and seeds, not enough whole grains. And the magnitude was just mind-blowing. There was a 30-fold more increase in number of deaths from not enough whole grains than sugars and processed meats combined. So the way I view this is that we know we live in this environment that is not health promoting, right? The default is that we're going to get sick from our food environment, but also, the fact that our environment makes us sedentary, we have exposures to pollutants, and all these things are chipping away at our health. I think of it as a health savings account. And these stressors are withdrawing from our savings account. What good stressors are doing is that they're putting deposits into that savings account, right? So they're building health. They're helping us repair the damage that's happening from the processed foods. They're repairing the DNA, the proteins, are ramping up our antioxidant defenses. They're cleaning out all the damaged components from our cells. They're increasing our mitochondria, which are getting impaired and causing energy disruption in our body. So essentially, instead of playing this health game on the defense, trying to remove all these bad stressors, when we're adding good stress, we're really playing health on the offensive, right? We're being proactive. And this is so empowering because I think it takes us away from this mindset of restriction and avoidance and what shouldn't we do in our modern environment. And it tells us, how can we add? How can we grow? How can we strengthen?
This is interesting to me because I'm wondering what your message would be to somebody who would say, well, we're talking about a nutrient deficit. So if I take a multivitamin every day, I should be pretty good to go. But I'm thinking that based off of what it is that we've been talking about, the phytochemicals, probably not going to get the same stress relief kind of benefits from a multivitamin that you would from eating the whole food, correct?
100% correct. So it's not just with multivitamins. I mean, this is bigger than that. We're talking about, like, what is our relationship to even getting antioxidants from food, right? So for the past 50 years, the common understanding from a lot of nutrition studies is that fruits, vegetables give us the antioxidants that we need, and that neutralizes all the free radicals. And the more antioxidants, the more neutralizing power we have, right? So it's kind of like if there's a fire in our body from free radicals, we're putting a blanket over that fire in a very tit for tat way. And that may work for phenolics, which is one category of these phytochemicals, but the amount just doesn't add up, because what we see in our body is that we have measured nanomolar amounts of antioxidants when we eat fruits and vegetables. And the reason for that is because these are toxins, right? So our body rapidly detoxifies them and it tries to eliminate them from our body. What we need to neutralize these free radicals is actually in the micromolar amount, right? So it's a different order of magnitude. And that is really the gap that hormesis, or the science of good stress, is filling. It's helping us understand that what the food does, what these phytochemicals are doing, is they're ramping up our body's own antioxidant defenses, right? And that's so profound, because that blueberry, yes, it has antioxidants, but it's really the phytochemical that's giving our genes the instruction to ramp up our defenses, right? So the food is helping us build our resistance, and our food is helping us just stay in this natural rhythm of balance of what our body needs to defend against all these environmental components that can lead to disease and aging.
Do you spend any time on social media looking at some of the interesting health reels and accounts that are out there, Dr. Sharon?
I do.
Okay. All right. So then you've probably stumbled across one or two who will say, well, listen, don't eat fruits, don't eat vegetables. These things are toxic. They are the worst possible thing for you. Where do you think their message is going wrong? Are they just hyper focused on the word toxic and they're ignoring everything it is that you've been talking about here? Or how would you even begin to combat that type of mindset?
Well, I'll start off by saying we have I mean, thousands of studies on plant-based foods that show that we have reduced rates of chronic disease, reduced rates of cancer, heart disease, et cetera. So we know at some level that these fruits and vegetables are helpful, right? So just having the recommended 5 fruits and vegetables a day can reduce our cancer risk by 50%, right? There are over 250 epidemiologic studies that have shown that. And I know that there's a lot of criticism around epidemiologic studies, but the preponderance of data is showing us that. But what we're missing here is that this key interrelationship that we've developed with plants is that we need that little bit of toxin to activate our stress response, right? So if we don't get that activation, the lack of good stress is not allowing us to build our natural defenses, like our hardwired innate ability to fight disease. So, yes, they're toxins, but they're not toxic. And that's the key.
Mm, they're toxins that are non-toxic. I like the way that you put that. I'm going to clip that, and I might use that as a response the next time an examiner me writes in or DMs me with a question about that. That was a money answer right there. Thank you, Dr. Sharon. That was outstanding. In the book, you also talk about intermittent fasting. So this is kind of interesting. You're talking about the antioxidants and things from these fruits, these vegetables that can really fuel us, and that's that good kind of stress you were talking about. But obviously, Dr. Sharon, if somebody's fasting, they're not taking any of that in at the time. So when it comes to fasting, how does this work in your stress paradox?
And so fasting is another way that we activate these cellular stress responses. And when our body senses that energy level is dropping, nutrients, specifically the sugars and the proteins from the amino acids, are dropping. At a cellular level, what it's doing is it's activating these longevity pathways, AMPK, mTOR, for example. And these pathways are what ramp up our stress defenses. So, very similar, the body senses stress from nutrient deprivation, and that activates stress resistance that makes us stronger.
Okay, so they're proponents of long-term fasting, short-term fasting, intermittent fasting. Just in your own professional opinion, is one better than the other in terms of stress relief or healthier? Or I'm just curious because I know that we have a lot of what I like to call fasting fanatics among us.
Yeah, from a hormesis standpoint, from the science of good stress, hormesis is really a mild to moderate amount of stress followed by recovery. And to get that mild to moderate amount of stress followed by recovery, the ideal form of fasting is time restricted eating. What I advocate for in the book is what I call a circadian fast, which is essentially limiting your caloric intake to 12 or fewer hours per day and having most of those calories earlier in the day than late in the evening. And that essentially takes advantage of two key things. One is it's just enough stress to get us in this intermittent fasting metabolic switch from when we utilize glucose to utilizing fats or ketones. And at a cellular level, it's activating these stress responses. So we're balancing our ability to become stress resistant and grow. So it's a repair process that happens during the stress, and then we're growing healthier cells. And the alignment with our circadian biology is just such a key component because we know that when we eat at all hours of the night, we are creating circadian disruption. And that alone is creating havoc on our metabolism. For example, we know that people who eat late at night, there was a study that followed about 8,000 people. It was done over 4 years. And men who ate predominant calories close to bedtime, large dinner, had a twofold increase in obesity. For women, it was a threefold increase. So just the timing of our meals makes such a difference in terms of our metabolic health. So the circadian fasting, in my mind, is the optimal way to use the fasting as a hormetic stress. Now, are there benefits to fasting in different ways, longer fasts? Yes, but it depends on what are your health goals, and it's not right for everyone.
What about those liquid calories? Maybe somebody likes to have a glass of wine or a beer or something like that before they go to bed at night. They think that it just kind of helps them sleep. Do you still hold true those same principles?
Yes, unfortunately, calories are calories, and our body doesn't sense that it's going into a fasted state if there's still energy. So whether it's liquid, whether it's from food, we're not in a fasted state. So what I mean by ideal fasting would be to have dinner 2 to 3 hours before bedtime. And after that, just to have non-caloric beverages like water, for example, an herbal tea.
What about golly, I'm just wondering, what effect alcohol might have on a person's stress response in their body overall. I would imagine that it's not exactly going to be that healthy kind of stress like a phytochemical, right?
Well, of course, there's so much recent attention since the Surgeon General's report on alcohol. And we know that the first step in the breakdown of alcohol to acetaldehyde, well, that acetaldehyde is a carcinogen. So that is certainly not a good metabolite, not a good stress in our body. I would put that in that bad stress category. Alcohol, of course, calms, it soothes us, but it would not be the ideal way. I would advocate for introducing more of these good stressors. And the beautiful thing about introducing good stress to reduce our stress, our chronic stress levels, is this idea of cross adaptation, meaning that you can take any of these good stressors, whether it's high intensity interval training, eating more plants, and they build tolerance to the other stressors. So we can become more psychologically stress resistant by using these physical stressors, right? So ultimately, we've known our mind and our bodies are connected, and a point at which they converge is at the level of our cells.
I like to hear that. I got a couple more before we can get into a few more practical tips and wrap things up here. But I want to talk about something that I thought was really interesting in your book. And you talk about hormetic stress, which you have been talking about here today. But you also talk about how that could potentially lower a person's biological age. So that's got an effect there. And I think we all have been searching for that fountain of youth since we've reached a certain age ourselves. So let's talk about the connection there, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is really from a clinical study we did on hormesis or hormetic stress. And what we were interested in is the stress that my patients are feeling. How does that translate to their biological age, right? Not their chronological age, but the rate at which they're aging. And what was really interesting is we went into this study thinking, okay, the higher the stress a person has, they're probably going to accelerate and have a, biological age that's even higher than their chronologic age. And we thought, of course, the opposite would be true. It was really fascinating from our data is that in people who had a lower resilience level, having a moderate amount of stress, kind of an amount comparable to the national average, led to a lower biological age than not having stress. And that's this whole idea of hormesis, right? Hormesis comes from this Greek word meaning to excite. That we know too much stress is harmful, but not enough can be just as harmful. And there's this Goldilocks kind of ideal hormetic zone where we take off, where we become stronger. And that's exactly what we saw.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I'm thinking about just me personally. The show, obviously, it's not about me, but I know that like when I feel stressed out because I want to achieve a goal, like that stress actually ignites a fire in me. It's not going to keep me up at night, but it's going to make me happy to wake up in the morning because it's like, how can I keep chipping away at this to make sure that I achieve that goal, to have that drive? But if I was completely zenned out all day, every day, meditating 24/7, what reason would I have to even get up out of that meditative state?
100%. So, what makes stress good is that it is very motivating. So, good stress aligns with our belief system. It's rewarding because it's something that's meaningful to us. It's generative, right? So, it's really contributing to something that's bigger than us. And when we are pursuing challenges that fall in these categories, the biochemistry of our stress response is actually far more intricate than just adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol. We're releasing dopamine, our reward hormone, oxytocin when we bond, the cuddle hormone. We're releasing serotonin, which is referred to as the happy hormone. And this combination actually negates or kind of counteracts our cortisol level. So, again, it's good stress to help us manage the chronic stress and its sequelae. And it's just such a beautiful way for us to try and get our bodies back in balance because again, we work so hard at removing the bad stress, right? So much effort is towards curbing chronic stress, meditation, and these are all wonderful, but they don't work for everyone. And adding good stress is really this completely new set of tools of how we can get back to health and feel empowered to be in control.
You know what? It sounds like you just described in a scientific way, nerd out with us, people, what Dan Buettner refers to as having a purpose in his blue zones research. These areas of the world where people tend to live the longest. And one of the key commonalities among them was that they all have a reason to get up in the morning, no matter how old they may be. And for a lot of them, it's getting up and making sure that you can help out in the community, help out with your family. You still have a role to do, a task to perform every single day. That all seems to fall into the good stress category. Do you think scientifically that may be what's at play with these long living cultures?
Oh, 100%. And the really amazing part is that when we use these good stressors, so doing something purposeful, well, it's a challenge, but that process at a biochemical level is creating synapses, which are connections between our neurons. So we have like 90 billion neurons in our brain, and there are over 1,000 points of connection or synapses between them, right? So trillions of connections. And the more we stress our body, the more we build these pathways. And then in the recovery, again, these are brief intermittent stressors, but in the recovery, we're reconfiguring and remodeling our bodies. We are literally creating the framework of making ourselves resilient. And I think it's such an important part because this has ramifications really for how we raise our children, right? There's this whole idea of stress inoculation, right? And the analogy here is to a vaccine that if we expose ourselves to these micro stressors that are good stressors, they're deliberate, they're controlled, they're very different than, adversity where we're uncontrollable, unpredictable, we just can't curb them, right? But these micro stressors are helping us build resilience by making our brain networks configured in a way that we can think more creatively, that our mood is improved, and we can problem solve very differently. So over time, we can handle more stress. And that's the whole idea behind hormesis, right? We're increasing resilience so that we are really upscaling our biology. We're increasing our human potential, which is something that I think every single one of us has the capability of doing.
Yeah, and you used the word resilience just now, and certainly that embodies who you are, immigrating to the United States at such an early age, coming from this political unrest. Um, Tell us a little bit about your upbringing and how that kind of changed or helped your thinking of stress and how we handle it. Maybe is a lot different than what the typical person might think of it, because I think that honestly, Dr. Sharon, if we were to poll the majority of people watching or listening right now, save the last 30 minutes of conversation, they would say, yeah, stress is 100% bad. But you were somebody who was able to overcome that. So talk to us about the upbringing and how that kind of shaped how you think of stress.
Yeah, so thanks for asking, Chuck. So, my family came to the United States in 1979. I was 8 years old at the time. We came from Iran because, as you mentioned, there was a lot of unrest, and we really didn't have a choice. And, like any family that comes to the United States or moves, the hope from at least my parents' standpoint is to create a better life, right? And, growing up, we all worked really hard because we were here because we had opportunity to learn. I had the opportunity to get an education, which I wouldn't have had. Certainly as a woman, I had freedoms that I wouldn't have had. But the idea that got instilled in me early on is that you can create a better life by taking on challenges. I was in eighth grade, barely reading and writing a paragraph in English, and I graduated valedictorian of my high school class and went to Yale for undergrad and Harvard for medical school. So you can always take on these challenges and create this better life. And when I started my clinical practice, that is what I wanted for every one of my patients. There was so much human suffering from chronic disease. And I wanted to create this better life for them. And I knew that we needed to take a different approach focused on salutogenesis, right, of creating health rather than pathogenesis, which is what most of healthcare does, which is, treating disease. And that sparked this entire rethinking and reimagining of what we need to do to get our patients to their health goals, right? It's like getting at that root cause that we all talk about. So essentially, my upbringing became this lens of wanting a better life, knowing that we're capable of doing more, of being more. But discomfort is the gateway to get to that level of growth and capability.
I love it. And let's put down let's end with some actionable items that people can put down to get that kind of stress growth that we've been talking about here today. We've talked a lot about nutrition. So let's start by also talking about exercise. One of the things that you really advocate for is high intensity interval training or moderate intensity workouts. So what are some specific type of workouts that fall into those categories that somebody might want to begin incorporating into their life?
So I'll give two suggestions because high intensity interval training sometimes sounds a bit intimidating, but it's what's intense for you. And if you are someone starting out sedentary, that can look very different than for an elite athlete. So your goal is really, and this is true of all the good stressors, you just want to get to the point where you're a bit uncomfortable, but not overwhelmed. And you want to do that briefly. And with high intensity interval training, you can start with taking whatever form of activity that you are currently doing, let's say walking, and just do it in intervals. So instead of walking at a steady, continuous pace for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever you're doing, do it in intervals. Go as fast as you feel comfortable doing for a few minutes, then back off, let your heart rate slow down, catch your breath, then do another fast interval. If you like doing elliptical, similar. If you like doing Peloton, very similar. Do it in intervals. So that's one way to get the unique benefits from the stress responses that we activate that we don't get from doing just continuous steady state activity. And another really quick way is that there was a study done on vigorous intermittent lifestyle physical activity, or VILPAs is the acronym. And these are 1 to 2 minute bursts of vigorous exercise. So running to catch a bus, running up a flight of stairs. And this study found that people who did that 3 times a day, 1 to 2 minutes at a time, had a almost 50% lower risk of cardiovascular mortality and a 40% lower risk of all-cause mortality and cancer mortality. So just even short bursts of that intensity are that powerful for creating our stress resistance.
That's good to know because downstairs I have one of those bougie treadmills and they have all kinds of like fancy little programs that they could do. And a lot of them are interval based training. And at the beginning of their programs, they always start with just walking. And for them, their higher intensity stuff is, well, we'll walk at, maybe 3 miles an hour for 3 minutes. And then for 1 minute, we're going to go up to 3.5 or 3.6 miles an hour, and then we'll ramp it back down. And for somebody who used to be so significantly overweight, I would imagine that just that extra half a mile an hour would really ramp up that heart, really get you to, feel like you're getting a decent workout in. It sounds like that's kind of along the same lines as what it is you're talking about.
100%. I mean, the concept behind hormesis or good stress is really bioplasticity. And it's a biological way of saying use it or lose it, right? So the greater the stimulus, the stress stimulus, the more we adapt, right? The more our heart adapts, our blood vessels adapt, and that's how we become stronger. But the flip side also happens. Without the stimulus, without the stress, we actually get weaker. We become more vulnerable to physical and mental illness. And part of what drove me to write this book is that, we know that there's a mismatch between our genes and our modern society, and that we're not adapted to eating processed foods. We're not adapted to being sedentary. But what has gotten left out of the conversation is we're not adapted. There's this mismatch from the lack of good stress that our biology has depended on for creating our resistance, right? We're losing this bioplasticity, and in the brain, we call it neuroplasticity. So essentially, we need to push. And this is true even in our later years. And that's key, right? Because the messaging as we get older is, oh, you're too old to be doing X or Y. That's for younger people. And that's the wrong message. We aren't too old. We need to push ourselves. And as going full circle back to the blue zones, I mean, that's the common theme of you just keep pushing to your ability, doing things that are good, purposeful. And that's, I think, such a key part that's missing in our health today.
I love it. What a fascinating 40-minute conversation this was. Is there any truth to the rumor that good stress can prevent gray hair? I don't know. You tell me.
That one I have not heard.
It's just because I made it up, but boy, wouldn't that be sweet? But listen, the book is called The Stress Paradox, and we've got a link to pre-order or order your copy in the show description and in the episode notes. Dr. Sharon, this is absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, and congratulations on this book.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for having me.